Hey everyone, I'm Andy McCotter-Bicknell. I'm the current head of competitive intelligence over at ClickUp. And before that, I was the head of competitive intelligence over at ZoomInfo. And I had the pleasure of building the competitive intel programs at both of these companies from the ground up. And both of them are in relatively saturated markets. So ClickUp with the work management, project management categories, and ZoomInfo with the sales intelligence, market intelligence side of things. We're going to be going through a chapter from a broader course that I built out called the Competitive Playbook. And we're going to be specifically talking about how you can win your market using competitive intelligence. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick. Okay, perfect. So the reason I feel really strongly about covering this topic is because today I really believe that competitive intelligence is one of the most underutilized but important programs for companies today for a couple of different reasons. One, without a formal program in place, knowledge is really scattered and inconsistent throughout your company. Different people from different departments know different things. They'll use different resources or assets to help continue to stay up to date or win customers. And they'll all have different experiences or opinions on competitors. And two, especially in the case of saturated markets, it's really unclear who you should even be paying attention to. So sure, there's like, 2, 3 brand names that just about everybody is familiar with within your landscape. But then there's dozens or sometimes even hundreds of other vendors that are out there that you could also consider leaders in their own right. And I'm sure you've probably seen some of these charts before, but on the left, this is the MarTech 5000. From about, I think they updated this a few months ago. And just has over 10,000 different vendors from across marketing technologies and just the B2B space. And the 4 charts on the right are 4 grids out of hundreds that are maintained by G2.com. And for those that aren't aware, G2 is essentially the Yelp for B2B software. And most B2B vendors have a G2 profile that they try to maintain and source reviews for. And unless you're up and to the right in most of those grids, it's close to impossible to see how you stand out compared to your competitors. So all these things considered, right? I think I mentioned 10,000 different software companies, in on that MarTech map there on the left-hand side. But what a lot of people don't know is that Scott Brinker, the creator of the MarTech 5000, he actually collaborated with G2 just recently, back in August, and they determined that there's actually over 100,000 software products in 2022. And on average, another 1,000 are being launched every single year. And so it's more important than ever, just considering this massive pool of different options for buyers, to really know who you're going to be up against, because there's really no chance that you're going to be the only fish in the sea at this point. You're going to be going up against somebody. And so that's why I think it's so important to really understand how you can utilize competitive intelligence to win in your market. Okay, so with these points in mind, I'm going to help you avoid some mistakes that I personally made in the past and really hit the ground running with regard to your competitive intelligence programs. And so I bucketed my recommendations into 4 steps that we'll cover today. First is going to be narrowing the scope of your competitive landscape and honing in on the ones that have the potential to make the most impact on your business. Okay, so let's jump right in there. Okay, so the reason that this is step 1 is because unless we prioritize on who we actually care about, we'll get ridiculously unorganized and overwhelmed by the sea of competitors in our categories, like all of those competitors that we saw in that previous slide with the MarTech 5000 and G2. And so between you and me, the majority of those competitors, they really don't deserve your time and attention. Unless you're a large company with multiple offerings, spanning a bunch of different categories, you aren't losing deals to dozens and dozens of different vendors. You usually aren't. Typically, there's at least 10 competitors that have the potential to make an impact on your business each year. These are the businesses that you should really be paying the most attention to and take seriously. It might be 12, it might be 8, but 10 is generally a safe number to shoot for. So how do we find these different vendors? An easy way of identifying them is by asking 2 questions. Who are you being evaluated against? And who are you replacing? Sometimes those answers will overlap, but in my experiences, they're 2 distinct groups, right? So first, who you're being evaluated against is typically the category darling at the time. Take a look at your category on G2, filter by who's trending. Those are the leaders that are typically being invested in by different companies and are usually getting really, really good feedback. Okay, it's often that those same companies are investing in really good proof points at that time. They're going to be investing in brand and go to market. And so you'll likely recognize them if you've been in the space for a while. So out of the 10 competitors goal that we set out a few minutes ago, you'll likely find 6 or 7 of them by answering that initial question. Who are you being evaluated against? And then the remaining 3 or 4, they're going to come from this next question. Who are you replacing? And you can probably rattle these ones off the top of your head. You know, they're usually the category leaders, the Salesforces, Zooms, HubSpots of the world. Another way to look at it is just whatever the status quo is at the time for your category. Okay, so now that you feel good about your top 10 competitors that you narrowed your category down to, run it by your sales team. They'll tell you if they regularly run into them or not, these specific competitors. And bonus points if you actually have these as mandatory fields within your CRM for opportunity records. That's a really great way to make sure that you're constantly up to date into who you're actually competing with on a consistent basis. Okay, so now that you have your top 10 competitors, we're going to do a little exercise using what I call the 3C framework. This is going to really help you identify the gaps and the opportunities that your company can actually take advantage of and start actually winning the market, right? Okay, so keep in mind, all of these company strategies are going to fit into 3 buckets as you're evaluating your competitive landscape: competing, carving, or creating. And as I describe these strategies, think about your category. Okay, so I'll bet that specific vendors are going to come to your mind as we go through each and every one of these categories. So the first strategy, competing for market share. These companies typically have really flexible pricing. They might double down on being really easy to use. They'll have really solid SEO, so they'll be easy to find. And they're usually only good at a few select things. They might not be excellent at, the entire solution, but maybe the most important things they choose to really double down on. And keep in mind, as I'm describing some of these things, this is not set in stone. These are kind of just loose descriptions to kind of get your mind jogging and trying to think about who might fit into these categories. That second strategy is carving a niche. So these companies target a specific persona, industry, or segment within an existing category. So video conferencing for educators, CRMs for small businesses, project management for creative agencies. Okay, these are different from the folks who are competing for market share. And this last strategy is called creating. So creating a category, arguably the most expensive and time-consuming option, but most fruitful if you get it right. We can all name the companies who have successfully created a category. These are the ones that have really unique narratives. They invest really heavily in educating the market on why it's really important. And they typically act as kind of a consolidator of a bunch of different use cases and workflows into one platform. Okay, so think like Gong for revenue intelligence, HubSpot for inbound marketing, or Qualtrics for experience management. The most important thing about this exercise, it's not to determine what strategy is good or bad for your competitors. It's really just to determine what gaps exist so that you can fill it, or that you can understand who you're actually competing against. Because if you're not targeting healthcare providers, right, then you probably aren't going to be competing with the solution that's in your space, but is only targeting healthcare providers. So that's one example of how you might not be competing against that company that's carving a niche. It's another, again, just one example of how you can kind of use this framework to really understand who you're actually competing with. Okay, so let's now take a look at how our competitors got to where they are and how we can choose to take action against them. So regardless of the strategy that they're actually pursuing, every competitor uses a combination of different growth levers. Okay, and this expands outside of just traditional competitive intel. Just so you know, we're going to start digging into other things outside, traditional marketing or sales. Okay, so this is when I think it starts to get really important to really understand how competitive intel can be a really collaborative thing for your company. Okay. The most successful companies, they aren't just offering a different product, right? They might have started out by leaning on product-based differentiation, but that's not how they scaled and became a formidable competitor. It's easier than ever, essentially, for companies to copy feature functionality at this point. So if you want really long-term growth and sustainability as a company, then you have to invest in other areas too. So today, what I'm really seeing and paying a lot of attention to are some of these other growth levers outside of product-based differentiation. So again, community, brand, education, and ecosystem. I'm finding that the companies that are really standing out today are really knocking it out of the park with one of these four. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples of companies that I know are doing this really well. Okay, so in terms of community, a lot of product-led growth companies are doing this exceptionally well. They're making sure that they have a forum of all of their users who are especially interested in their product, and they're all collaborating with each other, and they're giving feedback directly to the company and the people who are creating different product updates. But it's not just designated for product-led growth companies. There's a company called Lemlist, who is a sales-led company in the sales engagement space. So they compete with Outreach, SalesLoft, and they actually have just a Facebook group where they get all their users together. They give them specific advice on templates that they're looking for, product updates, and they actually connect with each other and they try to help them use the product better. And so a company that has really great community typically does really well within their space. Okay, now let's move on. We'll talk through brand. Drift is one of those companies that initially comes to my mind. They helped create the conversational marketing category, and they also educated the entire space about how bots can help qualify really high quality leads, even better so than forms in some cases. And people really trusted them, and they recognized their brand everywhere that they went. They started doing LinkedIn takeovers before they were cool. They released their own book. They had a very bold look. And so Drift is, again, one of those great examples for brand. Shopify comes to mind when it comes to ecosystem. In terms of education, I think of Gong with their Gong Labs content, their blog that they constantly come out with that teaches people how to use Gong in data-backed ways to improve their sales org. So again, think about some of these different levers that you can pull. And these are, again, great ways that you can continue to differentiate outside of the product. That's really the key here, because we have so many different products to choose from. It's really important to understand, okay, what are some other ways that we can stand out outside of those product-based differentiators? Okay, last step. So you've done the hard part, right? You've narrowed down your scope. You've identified your competitors' strategies. You figured out what their growth levers are and what maybe you can start pulling as well. Now your goal with competitive intelligence is to maintain that awareness and enable your teams to perform really well and win. And so there's this word that I stumbled upon earlier this year, actually, and I loved it. I immediately tied it to competitive intelligence, and it's zanshin. And it's a Japanese word that represents this kind of ideal state of keeping a pulse. So it's essentially like, think about, a competitor. They released a surprise new tier 1 feature. You're ready because you've been keeping a pulse. A competitor announces a new round of funding or an acquisition, and you're ready. A small competitor starts gaining momentum. You're still ready. That's the entire point of what a competitive intelligence program is for. You're constantly ready no matter what happens to you, no matter what external threat, activity might occur. Okay. So now, instead of giving you an example of a company that is doing this really well, I thought it'd be really fun to do an example of a company that didn't do it well. So back in the 70s, there were only really two. And before I say this, actually, this is not a traditional SaaS company example. We're going to go back in the 70s before there was even SaaS. Okay. But I still think that this is really relevant. Okay. So, back in the 70s, there were only two American brewers that mattered: Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz. And, that was at least the opinion of the Anheuser-Busch CEO. He was number one, and they were battling Schlitz for decades, and they really didn't notice Miller Brewing gaining momentum. Miller had started that decade out back in fifth place in terms of market share. I think they had like 4% market share at that time. They invested really heavily in brand and R&D, and then they ended up releasing the first ever light beer, Miller Lite. And at that time, Anheuser-Busch didn't do anything about it until about the end of the decade. By that point, though, Miller had continued to soar really highly. They ousted Schlitz again, thanks to brand and this new light beer innovation, and they were doing really, really well. And they started to really creep up on Anheuser-Busch. At the end of the day, though, Anheuser-Busch was able to retain that number one spot, but really just barely. If they had waited another couple years, I would bet that Miller Brewing would probably be the number one domestic brewer. But this is a great representation of how business works. When you respond to the unexpected, whether you act or simply react to things. And these four categories at the bottom of the slide, they'll really help you make those informed decisions. So tracking adoption for competitive collateral that you create, the confidence of your sales teams as it relates to competitors, and the overall competitor win rate. Those are going to be especially important as you get your program up and running and making sure that things are getting adopted properly and that you're keeping track of all the proper metrics that really matter at the end of the day. Battle cards are going to be really important, right? Those internal assets, making sure that they're constantly up to date so that your sales team can trust what they're actually going to be reading and incorporating into their deals. I try to review those quarterly, unless there's something that's really interesting that could affect a deal. And then I'll try to incorporate that more quickly on like more of a real-time basis. I'll conduct landscape assessments every single year to make sure that, again, what we're collecting is relevant and is impactful. And then win-loss reviews as well. Interviews as well. And so I'll conduct those on an ongoing basis to make sure that we're listening to not just our customers, but the folks that we're not winning with as well, and understanding why they made that choice. Okay, so let's review. We'll talk through how you can win your market with competitive intelligence. Okay, so first, like I mentioned, we're going to narrow down our scope to about 10-ish vendors. And to guide that exercise, make sure you ask yourself and any other stakeholders at your company who you're replacing and who you're being evaluated against. Next, we're going to identify a gap among those competitors. That's going to be, again, your opportunity to differentiate. So use that 3C framework to understand who you're actually competing with and understanding the strategies of those different companies. So it could be competing, carving a niche, or creating a category. Third, we're going to go deeper with these company strategies, and you're now going to actually go beyond feature comparisons, beyond that product-based differentiation. So understand really what growth levers other folks are actually using and what you might be able to incorporate within your own company. Community, brand, education, and ecosystem, those are all really big growth levers in 2022. But there are obviously others as well. So really do your homework and figure out what it could be to help your business continue to grow. And last but not least, pick a direction, execute, and maintain your awareness, right? So keep a close eye on the market, update your landscape assessment, battle cards, your win-loss programs accordingly, and make sure that you're tracking how your sales team and any other recipient of competitive intel is actually using the insights that you're creating. Okay, so again, I'm Andy McCotter-Bicknell. If you like this presentation, I post content about competitive intelligence daily on LinkedIn. And I also have a couple of other in-depth resources that you can dig into. One is an on-demand video course that outlines how I've structured my competitive intel program specifically. It's called the Competitive Playbook. And then the other one is actually a 2-week cohort course called Competitive Intelligence 201. I don't have it linked here, but you go to maven.com. That's where the course is hosted. That one, its sole purpose is really just to connect competitive intel folks with each other and collaborate to build out a formal CI strategy that they can present to their leadership teams. Okay, so with all that said, it's been a pleasure. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.